All right. Um, by way of taking a 1 or 2 minute review of yesterday, my goal yesterday was to introduce some broad themes that will get picked up in the New Testament. Really, the next 2 days, really day and a half, because the last half of the second day is I've set aside for Q&A. We don't have to do Q&A. We could actually jump into some other things, and I'll make suggestions when the time comes. But I wanted to hit some big picture items yesterday that will get picked up in the New Testament. So the rest of the time, we're really going to spend most of the time in the New Testament and how the New Testament uses the Old Testament, with an eye toward talking about prophecy, thinking about prophecy. And I'm going to try to flavor that discussion, with divine counsel things, using that as a reference point. But the next day and a half are really a combination of things that I want you to consider about prophecy. This is not simple. Anyone who comes to you and says, we've got this figured out, we've got this system down, our system works, it's beautiful, it's coherent, you need to realize that the only reason it's coherent is because there's a certain set of assumptions that underlie every system. If the assumptions fail, or if they are uncertain, then you need to consider the results of such things, to that degree uncertain. I've said before, eschatology is one of my least favorite things because it's just loaded with ambiguity. And my concern with the church in regard to prophecy is that people often marry being a Christian with a certain system of eschatology. That's a huge mistake. This might sound harsh, but show me someone who does that, and I'll show you someone that has a deep knowledge of one way of looking at things. That's a nice way of saying a deficient knowledge of all there is to think about when it comes to prophecy. And I'm going to show you that. I want, my goal isn't to disabuse you of any sort of system you have. My goal is to get you to consider at how tenuous systems are and begin to sort of zero in on the things that we can know with a high degree of certainty and not worry so much about the other stuff, the things that really are tenuous. So with that backdrop in mind, we want to get started here with something I'm calling Bridging the Gap. And again, we're looking at some major themes. And we're going to start broad, and as we progress, we'll get a little more focused. 2 items that I want to hit for discussion. Elements of Old Testament or divine counsel theology that require resolution in New Testament theology and ultimately eschatology, because the New Testament is progressing toward the end. Its view of the end. And then I want to talk about the cryptic nature of Old Testament messianic prophecy. And I alluded to this a little bit yesterday. And I think prophecy is deliberately vague in many regards. And I hinted yesterday that my reason for that is that since so much Old Testament prophecy already has, catch what I'm saying, since so much, not all, but since so much Old Testament prophecy already has its resolution in the New Testament, and it really focuses on the crucifixion and the inauguration, the beginning, the down payment, the kickstart of the kingdom. Since that's true, and the crucifixion, of course, is the central event to that, Old Testament prophecy was deliberately cryptic because God didn't want the powers that be, in terms of the cosmic powers of darkness, to know what was going on. And if they don't know what's going on, well, the disciples aren't going to know what's going on. Nobody's going to really know what's going on. You're only going to be able to really see things clearly after the fact. And all the New Testament is written after the fact. So it looks clear to us. It looks like, we can assign some degree of, literalness, some degree of one-to-one correspondence between things the gospel writers say and their reference to the Old Testament. A lot of times the gospel writers and the New Testament writers will quote a passage in the Old Testament to reinforce a point, and if you actually go look at the passage in the Old Testament, you'll wonder, did they misunderstand it? Like, how did they get that from this? The reason they got that from this is because the Old Testament, was not in an explicit, clear statement of X, but the New Testament writer sees an analogy between what Jesus did, what he said, what happened to him, an analogy with something in the Old Testament. And I'm going to refer to something I call a mental mosaic of Old Testament prophecy, as opposed to a checklist of explicit prophetic statements about Messiah. If there was a checklist of explicit prophetic statements about Messiah, anybody would have figured this out. All you got to do is be able to read. Okay, that isn't the case. And I'm going to show you some real clear examples of how, if you follow my blog, you'll know that atheists and other critics of the Bible will just come out and say, the New Testament writer just got this wrong. His meaning is completely different from the Old Testament meaning. Or he just messed it up, he was inept, whatever, or he's just making it up. And to me, it's understandable why people say that, because there are places where you just wonder, what was he thinking? I would never read this and come out with that. Again, it has to do with an after-the-fact eye toward patterning and analogy. It's not just reading a statement in the Old Testament. So, let's jump in here. What needs resolution in New Testament theology, and again, ultimately, eschatology? We talked about chaos yesterday, and I said, again, there are a couple ways to consider the idea of chaos. One was untamed creation that needs taming, and that was often communicated by the sea, the churning waters, some of this imagery that to an Israelite and a wider, Canaanite, Near Eastern person, to communicate the idea of something being untamed and dangerous, ready, potential for harm, that kind of thing, there was a certain set of images that would be used to communicate that. Dragon, Leviathan was another one of those images. So I don't want to flip back too quickly. It stands to reason that this same set of images in the New Testament might communicate the same idea. In other words, don't over-literalize this, because the Old Testament didn't over-literalize it. An idea communicated by image, we might want to consider what's going on in the New Testament in the same way. Everybody wants to talk about literal interpretation. Usually when people say that, what they're really saying is, if I don't think literal interpretation, then everything else isn't real. Then I'm like denying it's real. And I talked a little bit about that yesterday. Communication of an idea through a symbol or a metaphor or an image is no less real than something you'd handle or detect with the senses in a real-time experience way. If you believe in a spiritual reality, you should understand that pretty quickly. That just because I'm communicating an idea instead of an explicit point-by-point chain of events that you're going to actually, like read in the newspaper, with painstaking, degree of correspondence, doesn't mean it's any less real. So, as the Old Testament communicated an idea through images, we might want to consider the possibility that the New Testament does the same thing. Mortality and death was a theme yesterday. So the fall costs humanity its mortality or its immortality. Humans become mortal, they will die. Immortality is needed. Now think about this. Immortality is needed to be a member of God's family in His kingdom. Okay, if you're a member of God's family, by definition, you are going to live with Him and He doesn't die. Okay, so that's sort of part and parcel of the deal. So the loss of immortality becomes something that needs resolution. It needs to be corrected for you to be part of God's family. And how the Old Testament communicated this is very understandable for us. We have the serpent's deception and the curse that associates him with mortality, in other words, death, as he became Lord of the underworld. And we talked yesterday about how Satan, the Nakash, again, getting that title later, Satan, because of his adversarial role as the great cosmic enemy with God, how he became Lord of the dead, and he had a claim on all humanity because everybody dies. Okay, that was his point of power over all humanity. And that's going to change, of course, with the resurrection. Rebellion and sin was another theme. We talked about free will beings, both human and angelic, revolting against God's will and design. Curses did not eradicate free will, but made earth the domain where this continues. And often it was detached from a direct divine presence, and that expanded the problem, so that sin proliferated. God's domain and the human domain were differentiated, although they can intersect. What I mean by this is there was no more Eden. When it was Eden, they were intersecting, they were right there at the same time. Heaven was meeting earth. Well, the fall destroys that. It separates the two. God interacts with people. He makes a decision in the course of Old Testament history to disinherit the nations. We talked about the Deuteronomy 32 worldview. He calls Abraham. He's going to make for himself a people. God is not necessarily there all the time. He's there a lot of the time. When you read through the Torah, the stories with Moses and whatnot. But God has to make the decision to come to humanity. It's not an Edenic picture where they're sort of always there together. Right? There's a separation, and there are conditions that are set for God's presence to abide with humanity and for humanity to contact God. And again, all of that derives from what happens in Genesis 3. It's not quite the same as Eden. And again, these things were communicated by the episode with the serpent, the sons of God, again, the Deuteronomy 32 worldview, demonic spirits. So when we look at these characters later on, they're probably going to be connected in some way with this domain differentiation that needs resolution. We need to take care of rebellion, we need to take care of evil. The goal, of course, is to have a human family, once again, dwelling with God on earth so that it goes back to Eden. Yeah, this is going to be a major theme of New Testament theology. And we call that the kingdom. Okay, we call that kingdom rule. And again, with many Christians, the idea of kingdom is something remote. Something, someday we'll get that. And I'm going to show you and suggest to you that while there is a coming, what I would call and what scholars call a consummation of the kingdom, a final form, a culmination point, the kingdom is here now, okay, in a very real sense. Just because you can't travel to Jerusalem and see a throne and a temple that has latitude and longitude with a person named Jesus sitting on it, does not mean there is no kingdom. I believe we'll see that at some point. But just because it isn't there now doesn't mean there is no kingdom. Fourth theme was God's loyal family and his counsel. Again, the Edenic intent was human and divine sons living under the same roof, so to speak, and doing their own part in the family business. That's the council. Administration of earth, and of course they have their province, their estate, their domain in the unseen world, but there's a symbiotic relationship that was intended. Heaven meets earth, not only meets earth, but heaven is on earth, and it stays there, and humans are part of that. That's the Edenic picture. And that is going to need resolution in the New Testament. So, when we see sonship language in the New Testament, words like, children of God, sons of God, adoption, okay, that humans are adopted into God's family. The reason they have to be adopted is because they're separated, they're cursed, because of Genesis 3, but now they're brought back in. When we see language like this, it has some attachment to this back here. People of God, family, household language. Again, these are threaded, this is threaded vocabulary that isn't just cropping up in the New Testament. It has some attachment to what's gone before. Edenic garden, mountain descriptions, we need to have an eye for. Terms used to describe God's dwelling places, again, might be of interest. For instance, there's one place in the New Testament where our bodies are referred to as tents, tabernacles. It's not a mistake. It's not like the New Testament writer being clever. It's because the same glory that dwelt in the tabernacle in the Old Testament now dwells in believers. And by the way, that would mean that there's already a temple. It's called you. Okay? Looking in the mirror. You want to see the temple of God? Look in the mirror. Okay, it's something like that. The New Testament writer isn't, again, being clever. There's a reason why Paul refers to individuals as the temple of God and the church corporately as the temple of God. And that reason is because you are. It's profound, but it's simple. Mm-hmm. And so it should cause us to consider, well, maybe what was done at the cross, maybe what happened then, and what's happening now, every time the family of God grows, when people believe, maybe the bigness of that is something that's really considerably more spectacular than we sort of assign, to it. And what I'm suggesting is, I'm not saying there will never be a literal temple in Jerusalem again. I think that's saying too much. I think there's ambiguity there, but that could very well be. But what we do know for sure is that Paul and the New Testament writers do talk about the temple of God, and they associate it with you. That we know for sure. The other one we don't know for sure. So rather than canceling out the one we do know for sure and putting all our thought into the one we don't, maybe we ought to reverse that. Maybe we ought to think about the one and not the other, so much, or at least bring them into balance when it comes to prophecy. Fifth, earthly global rule. Edenic intent was God's rule be extended beyond Eden to all the earth. By the way, if it stops at Israel, it falls short of the intent. So if all of our focus is this kingdom, the temple, and things happening in Israel, that's actually less than what God wants. Okay? God is interested in recovering every bit of his property, surrendering nothing. Okay? So failure, again in the above, eventually led to disinheriting the nations. But the nations, even when God says, I'm done with you, I'm going to call Abraham, I'm just going to start a nation myself, okay, with this guy named Abraham. Even in the covenant, the very next chapter, the first 3 verses of the chapter, right after he's done disinheriting the nations, says things like, through you, through your descendants, through your seed, all families of the earth, all nations of the earth will be blessed. I mean, God still has them on his mind. There is intent, even at the very beginning, even though God's judging them and it's a punitive act and all that stuff. The plan is, I will surrender nothing when it's all said and done. So again, communicating this idea, we had, again, the reversal, we had the Babel event, the disinheriting of the nations. So we want to look for a reversal of that. Israel would be the catalyst for reconstituting the kingdom, to making it global. So in some way, Israel's going to have some role there. There's a relationship. Gentile inclusion was always the plan. Okay? So we should be looking for that and tracking on it. And again, since the nations were given over to lesser Elohim, they're going to have to lose their jobs. They're going to have to be displaced. And so that's another theme we need to be thinking about as we read the New Testament. Now, a little rabbit trail here. Excursus, Latin for rabbit trail, I like to say. Resolution of Genesis 6, of the Watchers, the Sons of God incident. I'm going to, here and there, be saying some things about this. So I want to plant some kernel ideas in your head about that. If you think broadly about what's going on in Genesis 6, there are some important, again, thematic ideas, the reversal of which should show up in the New Testament in some way. So here we have rebellious divine sons of God. Believe it or not, they're going to be replaced by believing human sons of God. Okay, when Romans 8 talks about the creation in travail and waiting the unveiling of the sons of God, that again, that's not just being clever. It's not just sounding flowery. Okay, there's a reason for things like that. Divine and immortal, they were punished to death. So they start out divine and immortal, but they're going to die. They're going to be destroyed. And the reversal of that is the earthly and mortal, that would be us, okay, are given eternal life. Again, it's a thematic mirror image. We have the proliferation of evil with the sons of God. Now, these items here are what you'd find in Enochian literature, either the Book of Enoch or other Second Temple books. They're specifically blamed for 4 things. There's giving humans the knowledge of spell casting, of course, the sexual lust element, violence, and astrological secrets. These are the specific things that they're blamed for doing that cause the proliferation of evil on the earth. Well, the proliferation of evil is going to be reversed, and some of it is reversed very simply by things like the fruit of the Spirit. And I have astrological coup here. The very guys that are out there doling out the astrological secrets, the astronomical secrets, are going to get hoodwinked when it comes to the birth of Christ. They're not going to see it coming. So it's sort of a jab at them. If you take passages like Revelation 12 to be specific signs of the birth of Christ that we can see after the fact. Revelation is the last book written. It's like in the 90s. That's when you get your whole list of signs. By the way, we're going to talk about the birth of Christ and all this astronomical stuff because it's part of this reversal. Essentially, when you see this, when God sends the Son, when the fullness of time, okay, the astronomical bodies track time. That's the way we track time. They mark time. When the fullness of time is there and God sends forth His Son, they're shown to be clueless. There's mastery here. There's ineptitude here. Again, just thinking in terms of mirror imaging and reversal. Council members who lost their status through pride, forbidden to return, again, either the Nakash, the Satan, or the sons of God especially, we're focusing on here. Council outsiders, that would be us, gained their status through faith in Christ and exalted at the eschaton. It's a reversal. We are the reversal of that. Earth to be ruled by many quasi-divine offspring, produced by divine fathers and human mothers. Well, Earth will be ruled by one fully divine offspring born only of a human woman. It's a reversal. It's a thematic reversal. Offspring die to inhabit the abyss, overspread Earth, and displace human life. That's their job. God's offspring die to inhabit glory and replace the sons of God. Again, the New Testament writers are tracking on certain ideas, and they're specifically designed to be illustrative and factual displacements and reversals of what has preceded. Okay, back to, again, orienting ourselves with, again, big picture New Testament ideas, things we need to just have an eye for as we read. Second thing I want to talk about is the cryptic nature of prophecy. Again, I alluded to this yesterday. Here's a premise. The substitutionary death and atonement of the Messiah, King of Israel, and its purpose were obscured by design in Old Testament prophecy. That is the proposition I'm asking you to consider. I do think that's the case. The disciples didn't get it, and some of them even rejected it when Jesus just said, hey, this is the way it's going to be. And Peter's like, no way. Pardon me, Lord, but that just isn't right. Well, he finds out otherwise. Paul, of course, calls it a mystery. There's no Old Testament prophecy that puts all the pieces together. Again, the way we're used to looking at this is, if I just read the Old Testament real closely, I can come up with a checklist of specific things, specific statements that are going to translate in a one-to-one way to what Jesus was, did, and said. Well, good luck with that. Connections are missing by design. The connections are missing. The pieces are there, but the connections are missing. The connections are what you can see after the fact. How the pieces go together. Where is substitutionary death connected to the Messiah in the Old Testament? Yeah, I picked this one because it's like the most fundamental thing about New Testament theology. So, like, where's the verse for that? Now, you could say, well, you know, it's Isaiah 53. It's the sermon. Well, Messiah isn't even in that passage, so you have to make that connection. It's easy for us to do after the fact. Okay? But there's a reason why Jews even today just think that that's not really clear, because it isn't. If the word Messiah was in the passage, well, that, you know, who's going to argue with that? Yeah, just an illustration. There's only two occurrences of this term. Two occurrences of this term where the New Testament authors actually use the verse. I mean, think about that. I mean, Messiah occurs, you know, I think it's a dozen or so times, or maybe 20 times, whatever. But if you actually go look at the verses, there's only two occurrences of this word in verses that the New Testament writers even quote. That's kind of shocking when you think about it. You'd think they'd be looking for like every reference. Yeah, let's quote them all, you know. Well, a lot of them have nothing to do with Jesus. You know, the New Testament writer, under inspiration, doesn't deem them worthy of even citation. They only do it 2 times. And they are Psalm 2:2, which is referenced in Acts and Revelation, and then there's Psalm 89:51, which gets a faint allusion. It's not even really a quotation. Now, let me see if I can, I wonder if I can click on some of this. We'll see what happens. Okay, that one's internet. I wanted to see how I put those links in. I was wondering, I couldn't remember if I linked to my software or not, but Psalm 2:2, again, if somebody want to read that? Go ahead.
The kings of the earth set themselves and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord and against his anointed, saying.
Okay. Somebody want to read Acts 4 now? Go to Acts 4. Acts 4:25 and 26. like a sword drill here.
Who by the mouth of our forefather David, your servant and child, said through the Holy Spirit, why do the heathen Gentiles become wanton and insolent and rage, and the people imagine and study and plan vain, fruitless things that will not succeed?
See, he refers to the anointed, again, David, but the larger context of Acts 4 is Jesus, the son of David. So there's a New Testament writer quoting a passage and making a link to Jesus. That only happens 2 times with Old Testament passages that specifically use the word Mashiach. And even that, I mean, if you listen to that, even that isn't like giving you a great deal of information. It's just saying there's some relationship. Yeah.
What about the theme, like the theme of Moses putting the serpent on the staff, or with Abraham sacrificing Isaac on the altar and the ram, being the substitution?
Is there something that would tell you without the New Testament that what Moses did, again, without New Testament commentary after the fact, that what Moses did pointed to a substitutionary death of a Messiah?
Not specifically.
No. Again, after the fact, that's a really fascinating analogy that the New Testament writers give us. It's coherent after the fact. It's a data point that's put into a picture, and when you see its role, when you see its purpose, when you see its relational partner, it's like, yeah, that makes sense. But before, it's like, a Jew would have looked at you going, I see a serpent on a pole. How are you getting a guy that's God incarnate, and when he's dead, he's going to rise? How do you get all these ideas attached to that?
Mm-hmm.
He'd look at you like you were nuts.
Mm-hmm.
So, key passages fulfilled again after the fact with analogies. Now, examples. Isaiah 7:14. Everybody should know this passage. This is the virgin birth statement. Of course, in Isaiah 7:14, the woman in Isaiah 7:14, behold, an Almah shall conceive and bear a son, so on and so forth. Why don't we go there? Because I want you to see a few things. Almah is not the most technically precise word you would use for virgin, but that's sort of beside the point. The Almah in Isaiah 7 does not need to be a virgin. Why? Because the point of the prophecy is not the woman. The point of the prophecy is the son. We often sort of flip that, and sort of zero in on the woman, because we're defending the New Testament, application of that to Mary, who was a virgin, and so on and so forth. It's understandable. 11, let's just stop right there with those two. So Isaiah 7:14, we have this, a woman, a virgin, young maiden, whatever your translation has, is going to conceive and bear a son. And what does the rest of it say?
Whom she will call Emmanuel. On curds and honey will he feed until he knows how to refuse evil and choose good.
Curds and honey. That is a reference to a child beginning to eat solid food, okay, no longer breastfed, they're weaned. So if you read the rest of the passage, what's the setting? Ahaz is scared. By the way, the sign is for Ahaz. If you go back to the beginning of the chapter, he's scared because he's getting ganged up on by foreign kings and other enemies. And Isaiah comes to him and says, look, God sees the problem. You're going to be okay. And he says to Ahaz, go ahead, ask God for a sign, and so that you're going to be okay. And Ahaz, tries to sound pious, and I just can't ask God for a sign, and blah, blah, blah. And Isaiah gets a little mad at him and says, okay, the Lord himself will give you a sign. And then he goes into Isaiah 7:14. It's for Ahaz. Why is the reference to the kid eating solid food? Because if you read the rest of chapter 7 and chapter 8, you find out that the prophecy comes true. Okay, Ahaz is delivered. Everything's okay. We don't really know who the woman or the child was. And there's the speculations because later on in chapter 8, Isaiah goes into his wife, has sex with his wife, the prophetess, and some people think that was the son. Some people think it was one of Ahaz's wives or whatever. Doesn't matter. The issue is that the sign is for Ahaz. Ahaz gets the help he needs, and he's delivered. If the sign was intended to be a child born 700 years later, how does that help Ahaz? It doesn't. This is why, like I said yesterday, and it's not an exaggeration, I'm being serious, no Jewish writer, okay, before and even in the context after Jesus shows up, no Jewish writer prior to the New Testament ever even considered this to be a messianic passage. They didn't even consider it to be a prophecy because it was already over. Why would it have anything to do with the Messiah? Because Ahaz is dead. He's been dead for hundreds of years. God delivered him like he said he would. What do I need to look for? Okay. Well, the answer is you don't need to look for anything. But, again, after the fact, Matthew quotes this passage about Mary and Jesus because it's analogous. It's a deliberate analogy to what's written there. Matthew knows the story of Jesus' birth. Why? Well, because Mary travels with him. You don't think she ever told the disciples a story? I'm sure when they see him start doing spectacular things, walking on water and turning water into wine, they're going to look at her and go, where'd this kid come from? Did he ever do anything weird when he was little? They're going to ask questions like that. And she's going to say, well, let me tell you how this happened. It's kind of weird. It's kind of spooky. And just tell you what happened. Angel showed up to me and said, you're going to have a son. Okay. Looks like that's working out. And then, when they sit down later and they've had a chance to go back through the scriptures and study, because now they're preaching the gospel, they're telling people about Jesus. When it gets time to write the gospels, both in terms of their own effort put into trying to understand their Bible in light of Jesus and the Spirit's assistance to connect the dots, Matthew's like, this is just like Isaiah 7. This kid comes out of nowhere. It's a supernatural birth. God announces it. It's for salvation. It's deliverance. Emmanuel can mean God with us, or God is with us, or God will be with us. There's no verb in the statement. It's Immanuel, preposition plus L. So you can translate it a variety of ways, but Matthew looks at that and God was with us. He really was. We walked around with him for 3.5 years, So they're seeing things clearly on the other side. Hosea 11:1 is sort of a classic example where Matthew, why don't you go to Matthew 2:15 and look that up. Somebody gets there, you can just start reading.
And remained there until Herod's death. This was to fulfill what the Lord had spoken by the prophet. Out of Egypt I have called my son.
Right. So this is, Jesus, his parent. The angel tells Joseph, wake up, go down to Egypt because Herod's going to try to kill this kid. And so they move to Egypt, and they're there, for a certain amount of time. And they come back, and Matthew says, well, this fulfilled, the statement. Out of Egypt I have called my son. Because Jesus moved back from Egypt. If you go to Hosea 11:1, that's what it says. It's very literal. Out of Egypt I have called my son. Who's the son in Hosea 11:1? Israel, the nation. So Hosea is not looking forward in time. He's looking backward in time. This is not a prophecy. Hosea 11:1. It's a retrospect. But Matthew, again, after the fact, here's the story of how, he's asking Mary, did the kid do anything weird when he was little? And so he hears the whole story. And again, he knows, he knows his Old Testament. And when he hears the part about, man, we had to go to Egypt because Herod was trying to kill him, and we were in Egypt for a while, and then we came out of Egypt and came back, came out of Egypt. That just can't be a coincidence. That's just looking like Israel. Because Matthew also knows that the nation, in a couple places in the Old Testament, is called my son. The nation, the Son of God. Well, this guy's the Son of God. That can't be a coincidence. There's something going on there. And so he notes it for you. He says that this happened because of this other thing that happened. There's a direct relationship here. This is what they're doing all over the Old Testament. Again, if you didn't have the New Testament, and we went back in time and we found a Jew, 200 or 300 BC, and we said, hey, look at Hosea 11:1. How do you think that prophecy is going to be fulfilled? The Jew would look at you and say, what prophecy? It's talking about something that happened, a millennium ago. What are you talking about? It's just not telegraphed. Can you decipher Paul's trajectory from Romans 10:18 to 20? I gave you this yesterday for a little homework, a little pondering. This is when Paul is talking about how will they hear unless they have a preacher, and all that sort of thing. And is it true that they didn't hear? And Paul says, no, they did know. They did hear. And then he quotes Psalm 19. And you look back at Psalm 19, and it's about the heavens declaring the glory of God, and their voice or their line, depending on which text you read, go out and speak and all this kind of stuff. Well, how in the world do the heavens speak? I guess that's a nice poetic, phrase. They look up at the heavens and we learn something. But Paul uses that, and he relates it somehow to Jesus. What is he thinking? I'll show you in a moment what I think he was thinking. But again, if you don't have the New Testament, if you don't have Paul sitting there next to you, and again, you're back in time and you're sitting there with your Jewish friend, hey, look at Psalm 19. Check that out. Read Psalm 19. Are you ready to be saved now? You ready to pray the sinner's prayer? They're going to look at you like, this guy's a lunatic. It's just not there. It's only, it's only even in the realm of coherent thinking after the fact. On what basis would one conclude that the Messiah would be God in human form? It's not, references to my son, because, hey, David was called, my son. The Psalms are originally, that have those kinds of phrases, or even anointed Messiah, were in reference to a human being who wasn't God incarnate. So how do you go from those references to, the Christology we see of the New Testament? There is no verse that actually says this. There are points of data that, once they are connected, do convey that idea. But again, the data points are there, but the connections are not. The connections are missing. And what I'm suggesting to you is that's deliberate. I would say Messianic prophecy is formed from a mental mosaic drawn from the Old Testament, not a grocery list. And the link here, I put in there in case you want to go when you get the slides. I wrote up something about this on my blog. I was going back and forth with an atheist guy. And, it's one of those wonderful things that you never planned to write, but that really were useful, again, after the fact. Because I just get so tired of, these claims that, Matthew's some kind of dopey, intellectual wannabe, and he's just messing up the Old Testament, or they're manipulating it. In academia, you hear this stuff all the time. And it's just a stupid accusation. Because what that tells me when I hear it is that you want the grocery list. You're upset that you're not getting what you want. Poor you. Maybe you ought to rethink the whole idea. So the link's there if you want to reference that. Now, why would I say this is deliberate? Because Paul, the New Testament says some really interesting things. So here in 1 Corinthians 2, we have, Paul writing, "Yet among the mature we do impart wisdom, although it is not a wisdom of this age or of the rulers of this age who are doomed to pass away. We impart a secret and hidden wisdom of God, which God decreed before the ages for our glory. None of the rulers of this age understood this." And we're going to talk about the rulers of this age and some of this terminology today. "For if they had, they would not have crucified the Lord of glory. But as it is written, what no eye has seen nor ear heard, nor the heart of man imagined, what God has prepared for those who love him. These things God has revealed to us through his Spirit." Well, we really wouldn't need the Spirit if we could just go read the grocery list. Then you need to be literate, not illiterate. But when you don't have the connections for you, you need some help. "For the Spirit searches everything, even the depths of God. For who knows a person's thoughts except the spirit of the person," so on and so forth. He talks about the Spirit of God enabling them that we might understand the things freely given us by God. 1 Peter, "Concerning this salvation, the prophets who prophesied about the grace that was to be yours searched and inquired carefully, inquiring what person or time the Spirit of Christ in them was indicating when he predicted the sufferings of Christ and the subsequent glories." They're trying to figure out what's going to happen with Messiah. "It was revealed to them that they were serving not themselves but you in the things that have now been announced to you through those who preach the good news to you by the Holy Spirit sent from heaven. Things into which angels long to look." And by the way, long to look is in the present tense. It's viewed from the perspective of the writer as something ongoing. They're still trying to figure this out, like, wow, how did that work? It's something that the angels are still impressed with. Just like us. Like, wow, I never would have saw that coming. Or, what does that mean? What are the implications? I mean, they're still thinking about it. So it was something that was not self-evident. Okay? It was not self-evident. Ephesians 3, "To me, though I am the very least of all the saints, this grace was given to preach to the Gentiles the unsearchable riches of Christ, and to bring to light for everyone what is the plan of the mystery hidden for ages." Okay, if it was a grocery list, it wouldn't be a mystery hidden for ages unless you couldn't read. If there's no connections given to you, then you don't know what to expect. Mystery hidden for ages in God, who created all things, so that, catch this, through the church, the manifold wisdom of God might now be made known to the rulers and authorities in the heavenly places. This was according to the eternal purpose that he has realized in Christ Jesus our Lord. That's a telling statement. It's not through the kingdom that'll get here someday. It's through the church